Hi, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties here. Apologies that we're starting a few minutes late, but I'm so glad that you all have joined today for our Fireside chat, hosted by the ABA Tax Section Pro Bono and Tax Clinics Committee. My name is Omeed Firouzi. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a staff attorney at Philadelphia Legal Assistance in our Taxpayer Support Clinic. I'm here in our office, as you can see, and I'm proudly sporting our PLA swag. And in fact, this is a very timely topic that we're talking about because one of the reasons why, in fact, I was running a little late is because I was just helping a client actually who himself thought that he was claimed wrongly as a dependent by somebody else, and that was going to then block him out from getting stimulus payments that he otherwise would have been eligible for. So that is just one of the many topics that we're going to be discussing today about taxpayer protection and identity protection issues, identity theft, and a whole range of things that relate to making sure that taxpayers get the money that they're entitled to, that they are able to protect their identities, that nobody steals their name or information or the money that they're eligible for. And we're joined today by two individuals who are experts in this field and who I've gotten to know over the last several years. We're joined by Graham O'Neill, who is a tax policy strategist at the Taxpayer Opportunity Network at Prosperity Now. I first got to know Graham here in the Philadelphia region because he used to work for the Campaign for Working Families, which is a free volunteer income tax assistance site. He's got his Phillies hat there. Unfortunately, didn't work out for our Phillies this year, but maybe next year. And Graham is a terrific guy. He's got great perspective. We worked very well together when our low-income taxpayer clinic would refer cases to his volunteer income tax assistance site. And he's going to be talking about some of the incredible work that he has done on these issues and helping taxpayers in various capacities. We're also joined by Elizabeth Maresca, who is a clinical professor at Fordham Law School. And I've gotten to know her at various conferences, various ABA tax section conferences over the years. And she's always been somebody who, as many of you know, has asked very insightful questions and been able to provide really good on the issues that taxpayers face, and she always has really creative, unique ideas and insights that she provides. I want to thank my colleagues at the ABA Tax Section Pro Bono and Tax Clinics Committee for organizing this and for your patience here today. And I also want to acknowledge that there was one individual who could not join us. His name was previously on the emails, James A. Proffitt. Unfortunately, he was not able to join. He is from the IRS Innocent Spouse Unit. He's a manager there, and he has a lot of experience dealing with that and with the domestic violence indicator. But certain limitations on his job did not allow him to join. But he did want to make clear that he could share that the indicator by itself doesn't factor into determinations, and even when it's on an account, it doesn't mean a spouse was definitively abusive. The indicator means that someone has identified the person's abusive, but it's something that a lot of us have dealt with. You know, I've certainly had clients who were victims of domestic violence, and that affected their tax returns, their tax situation, including with regard to the stimulus payments that we've just dealt with. But in terms of the conversation that we're going to have today, this is a very informal discussion, a panel discussion that deals with a whole range of issues that deal with taxpayer identity and identity protection. And so it's not, formal CLE. We're going to invite people, though, to ask questions. So you can put your questions in via the chat, and we'll save some time at the end, about 15 minutes or so, to go through these questions, but we'll also try and answer them as they go along. Some of the issues that I wanted to talk about today include this idea of stolen refunds. So we've seen far too often that for various reasons, taxpayers have their refunds stolen, whether it be because the tax preparer stole it, or somebody wrongly, fraudulently filed in the taxpayer's name and with their social security number, whether it be an ex-spouse or someone they knew, or they got a refund check in the mail and then it was intercepted by somebody because it went to the wrong address or something like that. We've seen a lot of those cases happen and then had to deal with the frustrating process of trying to rectify that. And so I wanted to see from our panelists here today what experience they have in dealing with that. And so, and then what are some ways to safeguard against that happening in the future? We know that there is this ID me feature. There is the possibility of getting an IP PIN. You could certainly file an identity theft affidavit, which I've done before for clients. And I know so many people on the call here have done that before as LITC practitioners. Graham, if you could talk a little bit about your experience with that, and including with, when you're preparing tax returns for people, this kind of gets to the idea of stolen refund, but it's a little bit different, of course, is, we see so often, like, you have somebody come in who someone else claimed their children first electronically on a return. And then they have to file by paper that they want to claim the kids. And then both people get audited, both people who claim the kids get audited. And so that's not neatly kind of a stolen refund case, but it is someone is claiming a refund that you should really get. And so that kind of gets to this issue of identity protection. So if you will, please, about some of your experiences in this realm.
And definitely. And again, thank you for having us. For those of you who aren't aware of the Taxpayer Opportunity Network or Prosperity now, I have to make my obligatory plug, but we are a national organization that represents vital clinics, anyone doing free tax preparation across the country, as well as it's open to anyone doing LITC work, or basically anyone who wants to work towards a more just tax system. But back to the current topic, I think, my experience when one of those situations would happen was the first thing you had to do was have the conversation with the client about whether or not they knew about this other person claiming their refund, or claiming their dependents to get the refund. And that came up a lot around CTC because there was a large number of folks who had no reason to file a tax return in the past, and they may have let a family member who they were either living with or not living with. I mean, life can get pretty complicated, especially when you're trying to just make ends meet. So we would always first have that conversation to kind of establish what the facts were, and make sure they understood what the ramifications were going to be, especially if they knew someone was doing this and kind of gave them approval to do it. We would always make sure they understood that, just to understand that this could cause that other person in their life to have some negative financial consequences. I would say that happened to be the case 40% of the time. 60% the person had no idea who was claiming their children, or they did know, but that person didn't have their permission whatsoever. And to be honest, it's not a great situation to be in right now, because the IRS does not have a expedited method for resolving these situations. Omeed said that each person is audited. Technically, it's an audit. I don't think it's not as in depth as an audit, but it's basically you get sent two letters go out saying you claim the dependent, call us to prove it. Whoever does prove that is the one who then is able to claim it, and then money will be taken away and penalties and interest assessed and all that. But that process can take up to honestly, during the height of the pandemic, which is when I was last in filing tax returns, we couldn't give the clients a good answer on how long it would take. We just generally would say 6 to 12 months, but towards the end there it was taking longer. So I mean, that's still the guidance to give the client. They have to file the paper return. You have to kick off that process of getting the investigation to happen. And then we would actually provide clients with a sheet of directions about what to do when they got the letter, reminding them to come back in, show it to us. Or, I mean, ideally, we would also refer them to an LITC, such as Philadelphia Legal Assistance, so that they could be more effective case managers in that situation. Because one thing that VITA programs are not are case managers. The operation is set up to be very heavily focused on January to April, obviously, with not a whole lot of resources dedicated for May through the end of the year, when many of these situations would crop up and when you would need to be resolving these situations. So I mean, that's in general my experience with that situation. Was there anything else that we've talked about that you think I should hit on?
Well, Graham, when you were working at Campaign for Working Families, did you ever help people with IP pins, or what issues did you run into dealing with IP pins, or like when you had to file a return and at the bottom, they ask for if you have an IP pin, and did you ever run into any issues related to that at all?
Definitely a number of them. I have a few notes here I can reference about that. To start off with helping clients get IP pins, we would give them instructions on how to do so. The nature of the process, which for those of you that don't know, the IRS preferred method is to go online, create an account, request an identity protection pin, which works for some people, does not work for lower income people in a larger percentage than others. So then the second course would be then to go to your local taxpayer assistance center, which for the pandemic was usually a no-go. I am happy to say now that the IRS has opened up most of the taxpayer assistance centers. It's possible to get an appointment at many, and they're actually going through a hiring drive right now to fill the 700 open positions at taxpayer assistance centers across the country, and make sure that they'll be at the full staffing levels for the first time since 2010, actually. So the first thing you do is you counsel the client on how to go online to create this, to request an IP pin. The second thing would be then to give them information on how to go to the local taxpayer assistance center. In Philadelphia, we were lucky enough to have one, or are lucky enough to have one here in town. Some other issues I think around IP pins is when a client would, they would have been given an IP pin in the past. One of the procedures that happens is that everyone is given a new IP pin every year to protect the clients. It's a good idea. Unfortunately, what happens is many people move, whether they be low income or not. Low income folks, though, do happen to move at a higher rate, and they don't necessarily, just like I wouldn't necessarily update the IRS on my new address. I might go to the post office and file all that paperwork, but I'm not going to go to the IRS and tell them. So what happened is they would have the original IP pin with them, but that wouldn't work, and we'd have to explain that you were probably sent one at an old address, or go through your mail, see if you got another one, and definitely to make sure in the future to keep checking your mail. If that didn't work, again, you would send them online, and then if not, to the taxpayer assistance centers. This happened less frequently, but was more troubling to both clients and us, is that we would go through the entire process. Part of the VITA process is asking if someone has an IP pin. And then you would get a reject for someone having an IP pin who had no idea what we or the IRS was talking about. to be honest, still not exactly clear on how that happens. I imagine it has something to do with a situation arose where the IRS determined that identity theft had taken place. They had assigned this person an IP PIN, sent it to the information to the latest address they had on file, and the client probably didn't open it or didn't have it, wasn't able to get it. So then we would have to again send them through the process of going and figuring out what that IP PIN was. But that could get very frustrating for the clients, especially.
So we have our first question, and Elizabeth and Graham, I would invite either both of you, two questions now to answer these as we go along. So the first question is from Kelly, and she has two questions actually. So she says the phone number 844-545-5640 to make appointments with the Taxpayer Assistance Center is constantly busy. Do you know if there is another way to make an appointment with a tax center at the TAC center? And the second question is for those with dependents, how do we request an IP PIN besides creating an online account? I should say with regard, I'll just answer for the first question. I believe that you could be able to make an appointment online with a Taxpayer Assistance Center. We have one that is incidentally just one block from our office here at 6th and Arch. We've been there before for child tax credit awareness. Elizabeth, is that something that you dealt with, the difficulty of making appointments with tax centers? And do either of you know about, for those with dependents, how to request an IP PIN besides creating an online account?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question, but maybe Graham does, or someone in the audience might have more experience than me with that.
I will say that besides calling or setting one up online, I am not aware. But if you give me 1 second, I do know where to look and try to find out that answer for you. But I would say that it is very difficult to get through to that phone line. I would also say that you should all expect that to get better in the next 12 months. The IRS has hired, I believe it's 4,000 people for the upcoming tax season. Many of those people are going towards providing the phone line with more capacity. Also, they are instituting some voice and chat bots that should at some point include the ability to schedule that appointment at your local tax center, but I don't have a specific date on that.
So we have, looks like we've got someone typing an answer here. Someone from Ben Lee from, oh, by the way, so Nancy Rossner says, I believe you can use form 15227 to request an IP PIN for dependents, which is what I think I've seen before online on the IRS as well. Thank you so much, Nancy. And Ben Lee from Temple, our neighbors here, Temple LITC, said, could you share a copy of the instruction sheet you give out so we can share it with clients that have not already gotten one / give our students an opportunity to prepare an explanation of the steps? Certainly, that's something I think that hopefully could be accommodated. How do you schedule a TAC appointment online? Well, I believe that, so I was just looking at this the other day, because I actually wondered if maybe somebody could answer this question. Is, you know, I thought about the other day, I was like, well, the free file is ended yesterday. There are not, you know, that many Vita sites open. But if someone wanted to get a return done right now, could they go to a Taxpayer Assistance Center office and even get it done electronically with the IRS? But Graham's shaking his head.
No, I think probably today they could. The IRS usually shuts down the e-files portal entirely. The date shifts, but I think this year it's the 23rd, but it's coming up within the next few days. So at that point, no one will be able to e-file whatsoever. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't think you can. You can always, they can still file a paper return. Obviously, that's not a a preferred method of doing things for the client or the IRS, just because a paper return filed now probably wouldn't even get processed until past the point where the e-file system will open back up in the last few weeks of January. So I would counsel that person to hold unless there's some urgent need to get it filed right now.
Right.
I was looking online. I cannot see a way to file an appointment online or schedule an appointment online, but I would say that when you do look up each tax center around the country, it does provide you with a local phone number that you can call. I'll say like many big organizations, bureaucracies, you're going to get different policies at different tax. But it's worth giving the local office a call directly, seeing if you can reach someone there and trying to make an appointment that way. I've had luck doing that when I worked with CWF in Philadelphia, though I was also told that it was like not the official policy, so can't be relied on, but maybe you can get on the phone and advocate for your client in that way.
So we have some really good information actually that people have provided here. So Kathleen says, I volunteer at tax aid sites with an online website where low-income taxpayers can find an appointment. So that is really encouraging. Looks like the modernized e-filing system closes Saturday, November 26th. And yeah, I'm sorry, I think that I was mistaken there about scheduling online a tax appointment because the interface makes it look so makes it look as if you could schedule it online, but it really is not. As I just looked to, you're right. You'd have to call your individual office, your individual tax office to try and do that. So I apologize. I thought I had seen something that indicated you could, but I just put the link in for the answer to that person. You just go on, IRS.gov, and if you just Google IRS Taxpayer Assistance Center, you should find this link. Contact your local IRS office, and you can find it there. See that we have somebody has asked about employment-related ID theft, and that's something actually Elizabeth will be talking about. And the question was, once the IRS has agreed that there has been employment-related ID theft, i.e., someone else has worked with their SSN, they usually find out through the underreporter process. Once the IRS agrees and removes the income earned by the imposter from the client's account, will they automatically issue an IP pin to the true owner of the SSN? And Nancy says no in her experience. And I just want to add something from my own experience. That's also the case with me. I was just telling my client who I met with earlier today, who not only thought that someone had claimed him as a dependent, but this much we have verified it. I think so many of us have seen this. He had unemployment in his name and SSN 1099-Gs for 2020, and he didn't actually get that unemployment. He never filed for it, fraudulently filed. This happened to my own father, by the way, and he had to contact the Pennsylvania Labor and Industry Department and tell them it wasn't me. And I had somebody who had a 1099 that they got for 21 that was also for income they didn't make. Now, thankfully, when we filed the return, we said hey, this isn't, income is fraudulent, et cetera, et cetera. And the IRS accepted it and even gave the person their refund fully, so they didn't reduce the refund or send back something saying we need to see more proof, blah, blah, blah. But no, there wasn't an IP pin automatically issued. So that's something I think you have to affirmatively do on your own. But AARP.org, they can do free returns, I see there. So I want to actually pivot now to Elizabeth, because she has some specific scenarios that she is going to discuss. I also, by the way, I will go back to Graham because he actually has a really interesting story about how he went into some prisons in Philadelphia to help with their returns there. And I thought that that was providing some really good perspective. But Elizabeth is going to talk about some of the issues that she has faced relating to employment ID theft and other situations. So I'm actually going to share my screen. So I have her slide. All right, can you all see my screen? You could see my wedding party there, but now you can see the PowerPoint. All right, so let's see here. So Elizabeth, you mentioned that you've dealt with cases of employment, ex-employer misconduct, and also issues where somebody has in fact worked for or used someone else's social security number for employment wrongly. So if you would, please talk about those cases and specifically the situation that you've outlined here on this slide.
Okay, well, first, we just talked about, like, I think the more common ID theft that we see where someone who your client does not know or has never met is using their SSN to work. Often what happens with us is it's in another state. And so when they come in with their AUR or their statutory notice of deficiency, it's not terribly difficult to resolve because you can prove that, you know, maybe they were living here, they were working, you know, where, where they live near you, and the SSN is being used elsewhere. I mean, I have had some that were closer to home, and they do take time to resolve. We had one once where it's interesting because you talk about the ability to file, but we had one once that was going on for multiple years, and we finally wrote like a cease and desist letter to the employer. Happened to be a meat packing plant in the Midwest, and my assumptions were, and people on the call and our guests may be able to opine about this, but our assumptions were that, you know, the employer had bought like swaths of SSNs and were just using them, you know, repeatedly to validate, employment of people who were actually working there, who were unable to obtain a social security number and to work in this country. So, or didn't have a work visa. So, in the cease and desist letter, they never responded, but they also never used the SSN again. So that did work. So you can always think about that too, writing to the employer, just in case you think it might be a, something that could turn into be a repetitive issue for your client. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this one case that we had recently. So these are the facts. The taxpayer worked as a livery driver for Taxis R Us, which is owned by Mr. Grudges, and he worked there from 2015 to 2018. Taxpayer and Mr. Grudges had a personal falling out that was documented by like some misconduct and then some weird case in small claims court and some issues with asserting that somebody was driving a cab when they weren't. Anyway, so taxpayer left Mr. Grudges' employment and Taxis R Us's employment. However, a year or two later, Mr. Grudges instructed Taxis R Us to file a Form 1099 miscellaneous for the year 2019, and the taxpayer hadn't worked there in 2018. And actually, truth be told, Mr. Grudges did this 2 years in a row. So we had a multi-leveled, multi-year tax court matter. I have to say, for those of you who do tax court work regularly, the only way we were able to resolve this case was because we used the remote subpoena hearing method. So the day the case got calendared, we issued a request for a remote subpoena hearing date. As soon as you get that date, you can issue the subpoena and make it returnable to the remote hearing, which now is going to be a couple of months at least before the actual trial date. And so because we issued, the person actually did show up at the remote subpoena hearing, and at that hearing, or their attorney showed up at that hearing, the judge instructed them to respond to the subpoena. And ultimately, they didn't have any proof that they paid this money to my client, obviously, because it was all about the grudges, whatever they were. And I never found out or asked. But that was the way to resolve it, like through that subpoena hearing. Without the subpoena hearing, I don't know what we would have done. It would have only been able to be returnable at the trial calendar, and it would have been a much bigger mess and a much longer ordeal. So I do encourage people to use, in these cases where you are sure that someone used your client's SSN inappropriately, to try those remote subpoena hearings in your tax court case. I don't think you can resolve this in audit. I suppose the IRS during the audit could have reached out to Taxes R Us and Mr. Grudges, whose information contact information we had. But unfortunately, a lot of times with AUR, they don't take those steps. This also happened during the pandemic, so I think nothing was happening at AUR, and the SSN was just, the notice of deficiency was just issued as a matter of course by the computer. I don't know if there's any questions about that. I can't talk and check the Q&A at the same time. Maybe one of you can let me know.
I don't think we have any questions about that case specifically, but if you want to talk about actually this refund misappropriation case that you have here, and also to I think this is the one that I emailed you about that when I invited you to be on this panel, because I found it so interesting. And I've had issues that affect so many people. Like I had something that where somebody stole a check from a public USPS mailbox that I wrote, and we've had one wrong number on bank account causing mayhem. So if you want to talk about this, please, I think this would be great to hear about.
Okay. So in this case, scenario B, refund misappropriation. The taxpayer had a 2021 return prepared by a preparer, providing income information. The taxpayer has a W-2 and no dependents. The preparer files a return that the taxpayer never sees or never gets a copy of. They get a copy of something very different. They use the taxpayer's W-2. They claim two dependents, the child tax credit, the refundable child tax credit, the refundable earned income tax credit, and then they misdirect the refund to a bank account that is owned by them. The taxpayer never receives his refund and then gets an audit notice. So these are just some updated facts from a case that we actually had in the clinic. The taxpayer kept returning to the tax return preparer, like asking for their refund. Where's my refund? When am I going to get my refund? And ultimately, was never able to get anything from the tax preparer. So what we did in this case, because they actually were due a refund, a correct refund, we actually ended up suing the tax return preparer and in federal district court. And we were able to get that money from the tax return preparer. Interestingly enough, we had turned the preparer into both New York State Department of Tax and the IRS for this misappropriation. Now, this was a while back, but they just never investigated. They never did anything about it. And the tax preparer just went about their merry way. We don't know how many other people they were doing this to, but, it's a lot of work, obviously, to sue a tax preparer in federal district court. It takes a lot of time. You have to make sure you have a good case. You have to, draft a complaint. You have to have the paper served. You have to do the filing fee waiver for your client. So it's a lot of work, but we were not able ultimately to get this resolved through the IRS process, through the taxpayer advocate process. We were not able to get this fixed, and they wanted the money back. So that's ultimately what happened here.
And we do have some questions actually about that case. It's so interesting. The questions, Mandy Matlock says so frequently, preparers are insolvent. Laszlo, who is a couple offices down from me right now, my supervising attorney, says for the taxi case, was an IRC 7434 claim considered? It's something that I've researched a lot. And then he also asked an IRS taxpayer misconduct complaint with a correct original return, not get a refund from the IRS.
Okay, so let me go to first the 7434 claim. Yes, it is considered and being considered. The thing about that case is there is, again, something going on behind the scenes between my client and this Mr. Grudges. And we were very concerned that Mr. Grudges would just make it worse for our client. And so we have considered it, and we just ultimately haven't made a decision about whether to go forward. For those of you who don't know, you have a civil right of action against a person who issues a false certain kinds of 1099s and certain kinds of W-2s, not all of them. You do have to look at the statute and the regs to see if, I'm pretty sure a 1099-C is not included in that private right of action. So yes, it's something we're considering. And I do believe there's statutory damages of $5,000 available to the client. And I do believe the statute has to say it's willful. I think there's the standard is a little bit higher than just like a normal standard, if I recall. But anyway, for people who know that, that's possible. And ultimately, in my case, because we did do this subpoena, and ultimately what they responded to was one check for like a few $100s, which we think was not even income. We do have pretty good evidence that they knew that our client didn't get that money from them. So yes, we did consider that 7434 case issue. Okay, so I think Laszlo's giving a really good suggestion here for the tax return preparer scenario. He is saying that you want to file a correct return, and that should get you the refund from the correct refund from the IRS. I think that probably is true. And I also do believe in our case, the client had paid back when he got the audit notice. He actually paid the taxes back to the IRS before he came to us. So we were in a situation of like trying to get him his money back, which the IRS could not fix for us, right? I mean, we tried, believe me, and maybe I should have called Laszlo. Maybe he would have been able to get it done for me quicker. But it did take us a while to get it resolved, and that's how we did it.
And we have a question from Mandy. Did you investigate solvency and assets ahead of your suit, Elizabeth?
No, we did not.
So, yeah, the 7434. Yeah, I know this could be a tough case. I've looked into it as a possible route to challenge misclassification, but the case law is divided, mostly negative on that. But I've written about it for procedurally taxing, and it is willful. You're right, the standard, and also that 1099-C isn't one of them. But it's certainly an interesting statute.
Yeah, so again, in my case, I think that we did have, because we went through the subpoena process in the tax court, we did have good evidence that our client never got that money. But then the willfulness is it's a higher standard. They're gonna just say like, this was a company, we went to with the correct information to our tax preparer, and there was a mistake made. So I think that was one of the things, the concerns that we had at that time. Can I just need 1 second, Laszlo? Hold on.
That's interesting. Yeah, we've had some interesting refund misappropriation cases. I know I've dealt with somebody who EIP check was, so not really the same as this, but similar vein of like it was sent to their old address and somebody cashed it, and then they got the Bureau of Fiscal Service letter to get them on the route to get a new check, so they got it. It's somebody who, I think it was one digit off the bank account, and then the IRS never sent a check instead of doing that. They just never got the refunds. They had to file an amended return. We've had people who EIP check went to a spouse, went to a person and had the name of both client and abusive estranged ex-spouse, and they couldn't cash it, joint bank account, to go through a whole process, try and return the check, maybe claim it as a refund on return. You still get VAT error notice. Maybe you got to do a refund trace. So there's so many things like that it's just like it can be very frustrating. And speaking of which, that is a good segue here for this last slide that you have, Elizabeth, about a joint return situation. Talk, if you will, please, about this case that you dealt with from 2018 return.
So this is an interesting innocent spouse case where the intervener actually came to the clinic for advice. So he had filed a joint return. It's a husband and wife. He had filed a joint return with his wife, and with his consent, every year she would collect all the income and deduction documents, and then she would go to their tax return preparer, who would file a joint return. And he always did consent to that. And this particular year, she failed to provide the tax preparer with his 1099-R, the husband's 1099-R. At that point, it was his only source of income, and the money was being deposited in the joint bank account throughout the year. At that meeting, she does also instruct the tax preparer to direct the refund into her separate bank account, and she got about a $2,500 refund from the return. And again, remember, all of his retirement income and the withholding from that income was missing from the return. So the IRS issued an audit based on the 1099-R and then a notice of deficiency. And she files a tax court case in response to the notice of deficiency, claiming innocent spouse relief. And as she says, and it's correct, all of the unreported income was attributable to the taxpayer husband. And they had been separated and divorced at that time, and it was a very acrimonious separation. He actually did file an intervention, which you don't see very, very often. And his claim was, even though it was his income, and even though that income was attributable to him, his claim had been that, because she misappropriated this refund to her separate bank account, that she should at least have to pay that money back, because that money, they wouldn't have been doing a refund. And they now owe about $6,000 or $7,000, and he feels like she should be on the hook at least for that $2,500 refund, again, that he feels she misappropriated into her separate bank account. So that, to me, these are like interesting facts that I hadn't really seen before, where the ID theft really is the spouse, again, misappropriating a refund from a joint return. Then the other spouse being asked to pay that refund back, and her using innocent spouse sort of to protect herself from having to pay anything on the taxes that were due. So that was that case. I don't know if anybody want to ask a question about that, or it's not resolved yet. So it's sort of still in negotiation place, but I think it's interesting. So I think in that case, the way to sort of deal with it, though, is basically to try to prove what happened with all this money, where all, especially in these he said, she said cases. And it's always whether you represent the requesting spouse or the non-requesting spouse, you always want to try to get your hands on the bank statements and any other kind of documentary evidence. So there's not, the bank statement is going to tell you sort of exactly what happened with the money. So you're not going to be able to say, you can't really, the bank statements don't lie, in other words, or the bank statements don't misremember. So in those cases, I really do like to get my hands on the bank statements.
So it looks like we do have some questions coming in. So let me actually stop the share of my screen because we're gonna now have time for questions generally, including about this case and other things that we've mentioned. We have people, so you represent TPH. This case sounds very familiar. Would the tax court have jurisdiction over the TPW to pay the refund money, or does the court only have jurisdiction over her innocent spouse claim?
Yeah, so I am not 100% positive off the top of my head if she also petitioned the underlying tax, but the underlying tax deficiency is correct. So they only, I believe they own, and the taxpayer husband did not petition the tax court in response to the statutory notice of deficiency. So I believe the tax court only has jurisdiction over the innocent spouse claim, but they can grant partial innocent spouse relief. So probably the best case scenario that the non-requesting spouse could get is a partial relief, whereby then the requesting spouse would be on the hook for some of the debt or the deficiency, but obviously that doesn't mean that that person would ever pay some of the deficiency, right? So just because that you have joint and several liability on some of the deficiency, that doesn't mean you can't determine who's going to pay it. I mean, obviously those things can be resolved in the family court actions or the divorce separation agreements, but that wasn't the case here.
So I want Graham actually to talk now before we run out of time, so if you don't have any questions coming in right now, but please put any questions that you have or insights or input that you have in the chat because we welcome it. Graham, can you talk about what we were discussing when we were preparing for this panel about how you went into some, or at least one prison in Philadelphia to help folks with returns, and how that kind of relates to these issues that we've been discussing today?
Sure thing. So in the, I guess it would be not this last summer, but the summer before. So that would be summer of 2021. When I was with Campaign, we actually went to Philadelphia's it's Philadelphia's only prison. There's several facilities in a complex, but it's the single county incarceration facility. And we went there with the purpose of trying to connect inmates with the stimulus payments that they were first told they were ineligible for, but then there was a Supreme Court ruling saying that they were eligible for. It was something that we had found, we knew there was a need from colleagues at Community Legal Services and other great legal assistance service here in Philadelphia, but also because we would get occasional mail from inmates who would talk about how they routinely were asking their administration for ways to file the returns, and we're meeting a lot of roadblocks. So long story short, there was about 2,000 people in the facility at the time that we went there. We were able to use new virtual technology through Get Your Refund system to make it so that we could send a minimum number of people into the prison, which was always the big roadblock, so that they collect the intake information, and then we could send those returns virtually to people outside of the prison to do the return. So we had the opportunity to meet with 500 of the inmates, so only a quarter of the population. We filed, if memory serves, about 430 returns from those 500 folks. 70% of them were accepted, despite working in taxes. I'm not good at math, but it's a very big proportion of the people who came for help were able to get a stimulus check. However, the 30% that were rejected, of them, I believe 70% were rejected because of an identity issue. Basically, it was rejected because someone else had already put them on a tax return. And for this population, they generally had no idea that this was happening because they were incarcerated, and in many situations didn't even think that they were eligible for it because they had heard they weren't eligible, and the information that they were by Supreme Court ruling never got to them. So I think it's something also to, if anyone has the ability to go and actually work in your local prison facility or has a relationship with your local VITA organization that can do that, if it's in, I imagine that the Philadelphia prison is not the only prison that has thousands of people in it that haven't gotten their stimulus checks. They just haven't had any opportunity to file. Same thing would go for a state prison or a federal facility. I think the new virtual options that are out there make it very easy for them to go in. And then you could offer as LITCs or as legal providers to be there on the back end when the people that they work with start encountering these legal issues and these identity theft issues. Because the process that the IRS has for that we talked about for sorting out the situation when someone else puts you on their tax return is very heavily mail based, and it's something that a prisoner cannot succeed at. They can't call anyone. They have very limited access to their mail. So effectively, and unfortunately, as far as I know, all of those folks that we were working with who got rejected haven't had the ability to say, hey, no, wait, I'm actually incarcerated. That person has no right to claim me and actually get their stimulus checks. But I think it's also something to be aware of for people that are recently, coming home from prison, who you may be working with, that they may not know that they're eligible for stimulus checks. But it's something I would, if I was running an LITC or working with recently incarcerated, it would be something I would ask every single person as part of the intake process for whatever issue they were there for. Because there is such a huge number of people that are owed at least a few $1,000s that they could really use, whether they're incarcerated or whether they're just getting home. So that's the situation we're talking about. Were there any other points, Omeed, that we discussed previously that I missed there?
No, I mean, I just find that that to be such an interesting story, and just this great outreach on your part, and it's so it is so important because a lot of people fall through the cracks, and that's something where people didn't know about their eligibility. We've had clients who are formerly incarcerated and they didn't realize that they were eligible for the stimulus, and so we have to help send them to Campaign of Working Families to file their returns so that they could get their recovery rebate credits.
Yeah, if I could address the question that Laszlo just or comment that Laszlo just put in there, and hi Laszlo. I worked with Laszlo a lot as well, obviously. Laszlo's question, I don't know if everybody can see this, is the IRS generally has access to information about who is in prison. And if they can see that someone was in prison for an entire calendar year, I can't really, basically they shouldn't, what I wanted to say is, yes, the IRS is supposed to generally know who is in prison. What we found out was that at least in the situation of people incarcerated in Philadelphia's prison was not the case. And talking to prison officials about the system with which the IRS or Social Security is supposed to find out that the person is in prison, who is then supposed to tell the IRS. It sounds like a system that is ripe for breakdown. But I can say that most of these folks, the IRS did not have any knowledge that they were in prison. I don't know if that helps answer. Oh, and his question too is, was there any discussion in the IRS about automatically issuing the payments to the prisoners without them having to file returns? I can't know the answer to that. I would expect not, just because there was, there's pushback from the IRS on lots of different doing things automatically, and prisoners generally don't fall too high on anyone's priority list, unfortunately. We did try to reach out to the wage and income department that would handle the prisoner flag if it did come up when we were doing these returns. We didn't really get any traction with trying to develop any kind of system where we could say, hey, here's a list of people that we know to be eligible. Yes, they are in prison. If the flag comes up, can you work with us instead of sending the notification to them because they're not going to be able to respond? That would have been the ideal situation. However, there was no. In fact, at the time, I emailed Rebecca, the person who formerly had my role. We tried to advocate for it, but the IRS just did not have any interest in developing any kind of system like that. I do think it's a good idea, though. It might be, definitely is something we can take to the IRS at Prosperity Now and see if there's any renewed interest, especially now that there's going to be a new commissioner, and there's been some progress at the IRS since summer of 21 in terms of thinking outside the box and coming up with different solutions.
Well, it's so. I'll just stay on for a couple more minutes just because we started late. So I want to acknowledge that and thank everybody who has stayed on. We see Barbara Heggie, who has worked on these identity protection, identity theft issues, saying, I've been working extensively with incarcerated folks in New Hampshire to help them get stimulus payments. Rarely is it straightforward. And it's just so crazy that like in 2020, during the height of COVID, the IRS seemed to just kind of on the fly there come up with the policy that incarcerated folks couldn't get stimulus, but it was nowhere in the statute. And I enjoyed reading the brief on the part of the folks who sued, saying like, this is what the statute says. There's nothing to say that they shouldn't have gotten it. So I found that really interesting. Actually, I think we do have some more time than I had anticipated, because looks like we're good until 2:30, so we can still stick on for some more time. Do folks have any other questions? Actually, as we talk about these cases, it's a shame that we couldn't have James from the IRS, because he was going to talk about innocent spouse and domestic violence indicator. Though I haven't dealt specifically with innocent spouse relief. One thing, I've only been a tax lawyer. I've only been a lawyer for 40 years. I haven't even been alive for 40 years. So the thing that I was going to say is that I have had cases, as I mentioned, and so I want to talk about this because we're going till 2:30. By the way, it looks like, so we've still got some time here. But what I was going to mention is that I had a couple of cases now so far where, and I know many of us have as well, where one spouse gets the stimulus, and they get the joint stimulus, so $2,800 in 2021, or in 2020 it was $2,400, and they get it as a paper check with both spouses' names on it. And the spouse is unable to, the spouse who gets it is unable to cash the check because it has both their names on it, and they have a joint bank account, and the other spouse, usually husband, is estranged ex-spouse, abusive former spouse. And there are the cases I've had that have dealt with this issue, that have had this issue in them, have all had different ways of playing out. It seems like that's often the case, by the way, with the IRS, where you might have a case, you might have a few cases that have all similar or same factual scenario, but then the responses you get are different for some reason. In one of these cases, the first one I had with this, you had somebody who this happened to them. This was in 2020. So it was $2,400, and she tried to go everywhere to get it cashed, and it didn't work out. And then she went to she came to us, and we advised her, I think based upon something maybe a TPS agent told us, to return the check as void to the IRS, to their Philadelphia office, which is where you also send refund trace if you're here. She did that. We sent a cover letter. We had her file a 2019 tax return as her own person then to try and get it. And she had gotten this check. His ex-husband, by the way, had fraudulently filed 2018 return with her and forged her signature even. So now, so she didn't even get her share of the refund from that. And now we're trying to work with her to get that share of the refund and file a return before the 2018 refund deadline. But she filed a 19 return before the July 15, 2020 deadline as her own person, married filing separately because they were still legally married. She got her a small amount of refund on there based upon withholding she had. Now, thankfully, by doing that, she was able to get the $600 in her own accord in late 2020, early 2021. But still, there was the issue of the $1,200 payments. She returned the check as void. Apparently, the IRS returned it back to her, or they didn't process it in some way, at least not in the way that we wanted, where we asked them to send back to her her own separate $1,200 check. So then it came time. She went to Campaign for Working Families. Actually, Graham and Jonathan were so helpful. They got an appointment scheduled for her. She went in. She got it done to claim her $1,200 as a recovery rebate credit. IRS math error in her is they said in their records and the transcript that she already got it. That ended up being that ended up being something we had to respond to. So we actually responded on the phone to the number there, and we were able to get a really good agent. That person said, "Oh, okay, I see what happened here. All good. We'll send her the 1,200," and then she got the 1,200, and she got an adjusted CP21B. So that was really good. But then, we had another case where this happened, and the person, we're still dealing with it actually. So I'd love to see what people think about this kind of a case. This is somebody who, similar situation, and this has to do with EIP 3, the $1,400. And she got a $2,800 check, wasn't able to cash it. We didn't do a refund trace yet, but she filed a 21 return, claimed it as RRC, $1,400, and then she got a math error notice, and we responded to the math error notice and sent a whole bunch of stuff, including a protection from abuse order that shows that there's no way that she was with this person because they've been separate and apart for a couple of years, and all kinds of evidence. And the IRS actually sent back a letter that said that this is a civil court matter and that they can't do anything about this, and that they're not in the business of figuring out who's entitled to what portion of what individual check. And so we treated that letter as a notice of deficiency. And the tax court case law appears to show that, it doesn't have to be specifically called a notice of deficiency in order for it to be a SNOD. That in fact, if it has the markings of a notice of deficiency, if there's a real deficiency on it, which here we said, you're saying that you're decreasing refundable credit by 1,400, so that shows a deficiency. If we responded to that, we petitioned the tax court, and they have processed it, and we send in the filing fee waiver. So we'll see what happens if they file for motion to dismiss or not. But I want to see, has anyone out there ever tried anything like that, or anyone gotten any letters that like that say like, hey, we're not in the business of figuring out who's in what portion of refund check belongs to someone? If you have anything like that, put it in the chat or email me at firouzi@philalegal.org, because I want to see. I see Mandy Matlock says that she has, and that's something that I'd be curious to see how it plays out. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we may have to do a refund trace. Maybe we'll have to end up filing a refund suit in federal district court. But I thought maybe that going through this process, actually involving the petition of the tax court, would be something that may have some more success to it. Just because, like, I've had good experiences so far with IRS counsel and tax court cases. But we have a bunch of, so now we have people coming through. So yeah, Mandy, they say it's a civil matter. I'm speaking colloquially, of course, when I say we aren't in the business, but they specifically say it's a civil matter. We're not in the, please, if you have any questions, call 1-800, et cetera, et cetera. So they just kind of say that they can't do anything, basically. We do have a couple other questions actually that have come through. So Polly asked, when the IRS makes a finding that a taxpayer had ID theft for a particular year, do they put an identity theft indicator on their tax account? I think they do. And does it make it difficult or impossible for a POA to access the taxpayer's transcripts through e-services? Yes, I believe so. And in fact, I've seen that happen many times where you'll get this thing that is like a paragraph long, right? And it'll be like, you can't access this tax year because it doesn't say specifically because of identity theft. But if you call the PPS, an agent will say often like, oh, we couldn't get you that because of identity theft. It has an identity theft indicator on it. But sometimes if you get an agent on the phone, apparently, a different agent, maybe they'll actually get you the account transcript or the tax return transcript. But I've definitely seen that happen before. But as long as you call PPS, you try and get a good agent on the phone who can help you with that. They might be able to get you the correct transcript that has all the details on it. Barbara mentions how we're filing the returns ourselves. We're fortunate to have strong connections with the FLIDA and TaxAid folks in New Hampshire, but they send people to us rather than the other way around outside of tax season. There are no year-round sites in the state. Terry Gladstone is our go-to person. Vicky LaForest is the head of the state's tax aid organization. So actually, and Graham's typing an answer, but I wanted to speak a little bit about this if he would. Graham, how did you, when you were at Campaign for Working Families, how did you decide, like, okay, we're going to stay open until X date? And did you, was it like something that changed year by year? Because, often places will just close either after April or October, but I know you guys historically, are often open pretty late in the year. So how did you make those determinations?
Yeah, so Campaign for Working Families would stay open and does stay open till usually October 15th and then closes because usually the tax filing software the IRS provides actually shuts down right around there. This year it's staying open a little bit later. for a variety of reasons. The way that campaign decided or was able to do that was simply more funding than many other VITA organizations get. It's because the city of Philadelphia for a while, and then the city of Philadelphia provided $1.3 million every year for their EITC awareness campaign. 760,000 of those dollars went to VITA organizations in Philadelphia to basically give them more the ability to have stay open longer, have more offices, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, the IRS grant is really not that much. Most organizations that are of any size who do VITA, the VITA grant is actually a relatively small part of their budget. VITA only funds only has $30 million every year to give out in general. So actually, the vast majority of VITA locations don't even get that money. So that's why you see this big discrepancy between organizations where they mostly shut down at the end of April. It's simply because there's no resources to stay open, or they're an organization that does things besides taxes. Campaign for Working Families is a rarity in that it's an organization that solely does tax returns, but it can only do that because of outside funding. Lots of municipalities have started to provide that funding. Some states do, but that's really the key to places being able to stay open for longer than most VITA organizations. That's how we were to do that. I can just say this now. I was typing the answer to Barbara. Barbara, you may want to consider reaching out to VITA providers that do 100% online VITA. And if you wanted to send me an email, you can. I'll be more than happy to connect you with them. We actually used their virtual platform through the drop-off service that it provides, which I won't bore everyone with the technicalities. That's what enabled us to do it. But you could do the same thing where you did the intake sitting in the prison, put it into the system, and then someone in California could do the tax return. And I also know that Code for America, who runs that virtual site, Get Your Refund, is very interested in helping that kind of effort. They, to the point where we presented at their summit last year about the effort because they were so enthusiastic about it. So if you're interested at all, please reach out. Terry won't be offended. I talked to him a lot. I talked to him yesterday, in fact. But yeah, that could be one way of getting some more capacity for tax filing year round.
Very good. Yeah, I've certainly dealt with that issue, and Barbara put her email in there. One question I see people asking about. So for cases in which someone who never owned a home or requested a first-time home buyer credit have returned rejected, I submitted ID theft, but has not been successful. Any tips? I haven't dealt with that. But when someone says marketplace fraud, do you mean I'll ask Angel if they're still on, do you mean the Affordable Care Act marketplace? Because that would be good to know and what specifically you're referring to. But I have found the marketplace. Yeah, okay. Well, so that is what you're referring to. I have had cases where I had to get a 1095A from the ACA marketplace, and I have found that they're really helpful on the phone, and they have a good online service as well, where if you create a profile there, you can get all your past, like your Form 1095A and for all the past years. But with regard to ID theft affidavits, generally I can speak to them. So I've had a couple that I've worked on one of the most compelling ones was when I was an intern here, actually, in the summer of 2016, somebody who their mother had claimed her wrong, or had filed returns in her name wrongly and in her SSN. And the way this was affecting her was that the returns showed she had income, allegedly, but this is somebody who was getting SSI. And so SSI was then saying, Social Security was saying, well, then you can't get benefits because you have income, you have earnings. And so what we ended up doing was we filed the ID theft affidavit. We went to Social Security Administration. We showed them that. We went to the IRS office in person to make this all clear. What really helped in resolving this case favorably, I think we did get a response. I think Laszlo told me after I left that the IRS came back and said, yeah, we found this was legitimate ID theft, was that we included a whole bunch of documentary evidence. It's a hard thing to try and figure out here of like, you want to be sure that you're giving the IRS everything that they need, but you don't want to necessarily give too much because you don't want to complicate and confuse. And especially now when you've had paper backlogs of millions of pieces of paper, you know, you feel like, well, I don't want to like accidentally slow down the processing of my case. But in this time, it was 2016, so it was in the BC before COVID times, as Les Book said once, steal that phrase from him. But in these BC times in 2016, we included a lot of evidence that showed that my client was definitively living at a different place, that her mother who had done this had actually been in trouble with the law before for similar things. We got proof from homeless shelter that client had lived at and other records that showed that really this is what her situation was. And the IRS accepted it. She was able to get her SSI back and running. And that was really, really good. So that's a good example of it working out. But, you know, I've had a case now, it's pending with an ID theft affidavit where this person, his wife has claimed or has filed returns fraudulently with him as spouse. They haven't even seen or talked to each other in over a decade. And he has filed these returns for the last, she's filed these returns for the last several years. And yet, you know, he filed ID theft affidavit for all these years because he wants to, and she's been getting all these refunds in his name, including the stimulus, by the way, including all pre-stimulus. So he's trying to get his stimulus through his own returns through recovery rebate credit as his own individual person. And he filed an ID theft affidavit. And yet, you know, when he filed a 2020 return, he got a math error notice. We responded to the math error notice and explained everything. And then the IRS says, well, he has to send a new ID theft affidavit that specifically now includes 2020 and 2021 added on. Even though when he filed it in June of 2020, you would think that, you know, they'd be able to go off of the evidence they have and see that the ex-spouse is continuing to file. So we did that, and so we're waiting to see now what the response to that is. And thankfully, we were able to fax it to Fresno instead of having it filed by paper via the mail. But I feel like with so many things, it's a crapshoot of like how it's going to turn out, and it can differ by case that way. But I mean, you know, we'll see what happens. And the same thing is true, by the way, for taxpayer misconduct, which we talked about. Elizabeth had such a great case to share there about that. But we had one where somebody, their tax preparer, behind their back filed returns that were different from what they showed the clients. And then the tax preparer ended up splitting the refund into two bank accounts, and one of them was his, and the taxpayers got some of the refund, but not all the refund that they were eligible for. And so it's just like, you know, now we file a tax preparer misconduct form, and now IRS, at least in one case, had said, oh, in at least in one of these years was like, oh, well, this is a situation where they sent a letter saying that, or no, not a letter, they said on the phone that, oh, well, we gave out all the money that we were supposed to give out. It's a matter of going to the bank now to try and get it. So it's like, now you gotta go to the bank. So it's just like, there are so many crazy scenarios like this that are different based upon what the specifics are. But we only have a couple more minutes here, so I think we're going to wrap up. If you have any other questions, please share them, and you can always email any of us, of course. Graham, thank you for joining. Elizabeth had to run, but I'm grateful to her as well. I'm grateful to James Proffitt, even though he could not join, but he provided some good perspective. I want to thank my colleagues, Nancy, Michelle, and Meg at the APA Tax Section, Pro Bono, and Tax Clinics Committee for putting up with me and their understanding here and patience as we started a few minutes late. I apologize for that, and I'm grateful to all of the people who have attended today on this call. Graham, you said you had something else you wanted to add?
Yep, I just wanted to call everyone's attention to a note that Michelle left on my behalf in the chat, because I can't chat myself. It's information on how to join the Taxpayer Opportunity Network, which I think, even if you're not a VITA provider, is a great thing to join. You'll get a newsletter from us once a month, a number of invites to our webinars, and it's a good way to stay on top of what's happening in VITA's world, as well as the general low-income tax policy space. We also have a tax roundtable listserv, which is a traditional email listserv, like I understand that LITCs have, but it's it's a good way for an LITC to ask for a local VITA's help in real time, or ask a VITA for a general question if you had one. If you trust me, if you send a question about, is there anybody in New Hampshire who can help with tax filing, you're going to get an answer within 20 minutes. You'll probably get 12 answers. So I just think it's a good resource for everyone on the call to join, even if you're not a VITA provider. That's all. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. And I just want to note real quick that the holiday season is coming up. We have Giving Tuesday coming up, Thanksgiving, of course, in less than a week. So if you're in the giving spirit, I encourage you to donate to the Tax Assistance Public Service Endowment Fund, the TAPS Fund, that supports ABA Tax Section, Pro Bono, Public Service Fellows. I was one such person, a Christine A. Brunswick Public Service Fellow. That's how I started here. Supports young public interest lawyers who are going to work as attorneys in low-income taxpayer clinics across the country. It's a great resource. Go to abatapsendowment.org and you can donate today. And we thank you all for joining, and I hope you all have a good weekend. Happy Thanksgiving to those who celebrate, and I hope everybody is staying warm out there. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.